pretty much the current or former border of Hungary, near Vienna. This whole area was Ottoman. This period was a period of chronic conflict, and the frontier was the locus of much of this conflict. Both empires, both great empires, had strings of border fortifications and garrisons along the frontier, and the troops of each were there to both defend their respective empires, but also, as we'll see, they had a great deal to do with the groups across the way. When I talk about the early modern period, I'm really talking about, certainly for Ottoman terms or for terms of the Middle East, the period from, we can say, 1453, the conquest of Istanbul, until about 1800. And so, why is it early modern and not modern? Because it's not really medieval, nor is it yet fully modern. So historians like the phrase early modern. It's vague enough to cover a multitude of sins. Hungary was, of course, conquered by Kanuni Suleiman, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, after the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, which destroyed the medieval Hungarian kingdom. Hungary was then later incorporated as a province, or a couple of provinces of the empire. We see fairly steady lines, a fairly steady border between Habsburg and Ottoman territory in this period. There are some key points of warfare where the border moved slightly, but for the most part it remained in the same region. The 17th century, opened with a major war, usually called the Long War, between Ottomans and Habsburgs, 1593 rather, to 1606. And then we have basically a period of minor warfare, with one major exception, until the end of the century, starting with the Second Siege of Vienna, the Ottoman attempt to conquer Vienna in 1683, the defeat before Vienna by Jan Sobieski, the King of Poland, and a group of allied forces, allied with the Habsburgs, and then called the Holy League, and then the fight with the Holy League, which pushed the Ottomans back out of Hungary effectively in the years subsequent to 1683. The one exception would be the period of 1663-64, when there's another major war between Ottomans and Habsburgs in this region, but which doesn't result in any sort of real change in territory. Although the Ottomans lose the only major battle, they really end up winning the war. There's no real change. The Ottomans maintain their hold in the region. Now, when we look at this region, when we look at this period, when we think about the conflict between the Christian Habsburg Empire and the Muslim Ottoman Empire, rhetorically, we always see this portrayed as, to put it in very modern terms, a clash of civilizations. Christianity versus Islam, East versus West. And we have a sense that these are firm divides, that this borderline is, to use again a modern metaphor, an iron curtain, in the same way that the East-West divide was during the Cold War. But in fact, when we look at the situation on the ground, when we look at the realities of life on the frontier in the early modern period, things are far from this divided, far from this clearly split. In reality, we see a great deal of interaction across the frontier, across the border. Interaction at the lowest levels of society, among the peasants, at sort of what we call the middle levels, among the soldiers who are garrisoning both forts, and at the highest levels, among the officials on both the Habsburg and Ottoman sides. We see connections, we see crossing over, border crossings. And that's what I want to talk about tonight, some of these connections across the frontier at various levels. Frontiers themselves are fascinating areas of study. They are transitional zones. They are not hard and fast lines. It is clear, you look on a map and there's a line, a border, a line. When you go in reality to the crossing between two countries, there are checkposts and things, but it's not clearly defined as a line. When you live along a frontier, it's very much not a dividing line at all. Frontiers are better thought of as zones. Zones of interconnection, zones of interpenetration. Things don't just stop here and start there. There are connections across. There's a merging in some ways. And that merging can be seen very directly in the lives and lifestyles of the people who live along the frontier. The frontier population. The populations on frontiers, any frontier, has been called marginal. Owen Lattimore, the great scholar of Central Asia, coined the sense, and he wrote,
it is often possible to describe the border populations on both sides of the frontier taken together as a joint community that is functionally recognizable, though not institutionally defined. That is to say, we can look at the population on both sides of a border and see them as a group together, not group A over here and group B over here separated by this line, but as a community, a singular community, not defined by any clear institutions, but culturally, socially, perhaps involved, taken together. They have to be seen together as a whole. Lattimore is, very quick, and I think it's a great example. The example he gives to make this very clear is the example of smuggling, right? Smuggling, by its very nature, has to occur on a frontier of separation, where states don't want certain items or things being taken across. And yet, smuggling exists because someone on one side of a border and someone on the other side of the border see it in their own interests, financial interests, to work together, to move whatever that item is across the border illegally, bypassing any control, both to the economic benefit of both. So smuggling is a very clear way we can see this frontier population being unified, being a joint population, being a marginal population. The fact that the people on the frontier are willing to work with others across the way for their own interests against the interests of their own respective central governments. Trade also, smuggling is illegal trade. Legal trade also occurs across frontiers, across borders. And people who conduct this trade are also marginal. They can exist on both sides. They have connections on both sides. And if we look at a militarized frontier, like the Ottomans and Habsburgs in the 17th century, we can see raiding, attacking the other side for booty, for goods that they can take back. That's also another way that there are these social interactions, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Not the best kind of social interaction. You really don't want troops from the other side raiding your village, but an interaction nonetheless. As I said, there are connections at all levels of society. At the lowest level, the reaya, the peasantry, the population along the frontier, the Ottoman-Habsburg Frontier in Hungary in this period, were connected. Although they were ruled by two different states, they were connected in many ways. For the first part, they were both what we would now call Hungarians. They spoke Hungarian. Both these groups are, Christian. They had a similar religion. They lived similar lifestyles, agrarian lifestyles. And here is a more direct sort of map of the Ottoman-Habsburg frontier. The frontier running pretty much here. Yarmouth was an Ottoman fort for most of this period, running really just east of Vienna. All this area was Ottoman. And this gives you a sense of the Danubian provinces and the major fortresses in this region. So the peasants on both sides were connected. They spoke a similar language. They spoke the same language. They shared the same culture. They may have been ruled from Vienna or ruled from Istanbul, but they lived similar lives. They had connections. They may have been related to people across the way. One of the other ways in which they were connected, again, was not good for them, was double taxation. Landholders on both sides of the frontier, in many cases, continued to claim properties on the far side of the frontier. That is to say, Hungarian nobles, who were now in the Habsburg territory, still considered the land which they had held, which was held by the Ottomans then, to be their land, and the taxes generated from it to be owed to them. So these landholders, these landlords, felt that the population, the peasants there, should be paying them their taxes. Similarly, as the border shifted, the Ottomans continued to believe that villages that had been ruled under Ottoman rule, had been surveyed by the Ottomans, whose taxes were assessed and still in the Ottoman tax records, continued to owe those taxes to the Ottoman state, even though they might have been ruled by the Habsburgs in this period. And so in both cases, groups continued to collect. Now, how do you collect this money? Well, you get your friends and you ride across the border, because if you're a landholder or an Ottoman official, you're armed, you're a militarized group. You go over and you go into the village and you say, you've got to pay us today. And if they say, well, the local tax collector just came yesterday, basically you say, I don't care. You owe me this money and I'm going to take it.